We're going to start our questions on ambition. I had classified all the questions that people had asked you. And so this is the third one. This is on ambition. So, what is the world teacher Sri J. Krishnamurti's perception on ambition?
Um, Krishnamurti said that very significantly that ambition is poison, and it's a deadly statement for proclivity in consciousness, which is itself deadly, namely ambition, because ambition entails the highest form of self-aggrandizement, and then extremely divisive in thought and feeling, and competitive, brutally competitive, and wanting to snuff out every other contender for the goal which you are seeking, and wanting to build an empire without any respect for ethical means. That's ambition. The means does not matter. And very significantly, the world teacher said that the means itself is the end, which is something for us to think about. But everywhere else you will find that in mainstream society, there is a gulf between means and end, and people seem to think that you can adopt any means provided you reach the end. Now, Krishnamurti's take is not supportive of that. He says the means itself is the end. So there must be virtue in the beginning if there has to be virtue in the end. And there has to be ethics in the beginning if there has to be ethics at the end. In that sense, ambition is poison.
But then I would like to draw your attention to ambition is poison. Seems more relevant to a case like in Hitler's case. He was extremely ambitious.
Of course.
So you can't call that ethical or being honest or anything. And so the end was a disastrous end.
Of course. Of course.
So maybe some other example, maybe you could throw up. I mean, I mentioned Hitler.
I mean, history is not lacking in providing us with any number of illustrative examples. And let me start with from the Indian epic, the Mahabharata. And there you find that the villain, the main villain, Duryodhana, now he is the Yuvaraja or the prince who is going to get the crown tomorrow on the Kaurava side. And he's the epitome of ambition. And if you watch the entire 54 episode serial on the Mahabharata, you can pick up that every cell in his body and every pore in his body is reeking of ambition, which is a kind of limitless, heightened self-centeredness, where the means does not matter at all. And what he's contending for, that's the only thing that matters to him. Not what happens to anybody else, even if he kills off hundreds and thousands of people in the process. So we know that from the Mahabharata, which is one of the timeless lessons in history for the Hindus. And now let's go to the Western world. And I think from the Western world, the most outstanding example of ambition is one of Shakespeare's classical works, the tragedy of Macbeth, something probably in the early 17th century. And this is the story of a Scottish military general by name Macbeth, and who was very jealous of the King of Scotland. And he wanted to usurp power from him. So he and his wife were scheming. That's the whole Shakespearean tragedy is revolving around that conspiracy, ambition. And finally, he murders the king. And then, in order to cover up the murder, he commits a large number of other murders in the sequel. And finally, what is the culmination of the whole thing? The culmination is that he dies an ignominious death preceded by insanity and dishonor and disgrace. So that is the final fruit of a life of ambition. Therefore, Krishnamurti is born out that ambition is deadly poison.
Yeah.
And we could marshal any number of other examples in the political sphere, in the sphere of the business world. in the sphere, in the social sphere, and even in the spiritual sphere.
Yeah.
If we just look around, we've got to be very alert, and we've got to watch what's happening in society, and we will discover for ourselves. We don't have to believe what the world teacher is saying, but we can discover for ourselves that this is deadly poison, and it beautifully is in sync with what Krishnamurti has said, that the self is evil, because it's the self which is ambitious.
Yeah. So now, what does Sanatana Dharma have to say about ambition?
Oh, this is a very interesting question, because while Sri J. Krishnamurti is in the bullseye where ambition is concerned, and he's putting it on the table, bringing it into relief and showing it in all its ugliness and in its evil nature. Sanatana Dharma, which is the evolving and changing understanding of human life and the divine for the Hindus, is more understanding of how this evil comes into existence. And in the deeper Hindu view of life, evil actually cannot be snuffed out from the totality of life. It has got a way of creeping in through the back door, if not through the front door.
Two sides of the same coin?
Not really, because the moment there is creation, there are polar opposites of the good and evil coming together as a pair. So it's a question of proportion, which is dominating, whether good is dominating or evil is dominating. Sometimes good will dominate, sometimes evil will dominate, depending on the divine architecture. And Sanatana Dharma says it gives a more balanced and wide-ranging verdict. So what is that? So it says that the totality of man's life may be divided into a materialistic part one consisting of artha and kama. Artha is quest for wealth and quest for name and fame, and kama is the pursuit of pleasure, the aesthetic enjoyment of life. That's part one. And part two is the quest for the divine, because we need that in order to end the suffering, which is inevitable in part one. So there are two parts in Sanatana Dharma. And Sanatana Dharma says that in part one, this evil of ambition cannot be entirely snuffed out. And it is wise enough to see that even if we allow this evil, because we cannot snuff it out, it's anyhow going to erupt like a volcano. And it's going to burn itself out and end in disaster and calamity. You can see that even in modern society, not only in distant history, but even in our own times. So it allows that ambition, not because it is fostering and welcoming that ambition and pampering that ambition, no, because it realizes that it is unavoidable. So it allows it to be, the evil to be. And then the evil will play out, and then it will come to naught. That's the inevitable end. Now, when you come to dharma and moksha, Sanatana Dharma is more stringent. It is very clear in its verdict, like the world teacher. It's saying that in the spiritual spheres of dharma and moksha, ambition has no place, because dharma and moksha are all about self-abnegation, winding up the show of the self and bringing it to naught. And obviously, on that canvas where the whole thing is to wind up the show of the self, there you cannot talk of self-aggrandizement. There is no place for it. So Sanatana Dharma, in part one, it is condoning, it is tolerating, it is inevitably admitting. And part two, it pulls the guillotine on the neck of ambition. So Sanatana Dharma's verdict is that.
Yeah. So that would be the stark difference then, perhaps, in the perception of Sanatana Dharma and Krishnamurti's perception of ambition.
Yes.
To some extent, there's an overlap, isn't it?
There is, of course, there is an overlap, and yes, that is there is a sharp difference. The verdict of Sanatana Dharma is more magnanimous, is more broad-minded, and because it realizes the inevitability of evil in life, and therefore it apportions a portion of the totality of life where this evil can take birth and where it can reside and where it can self-annihilate itself. Now, Krishnamurti is talking entirely of the spiritual sphere of dharma and moksha, where evil has no place because it's a contradiction. You cannot have self-aggrandizement where you must have self-abnegation, where you must have the ending of the life of the self. So, Krishnamurti pertains to one sphere and Sanatana Dharma pertains to a broader sphere.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, now let's move on then to the next lot of questions. Okay, this is on turning inward. So, Sri J. Krishnamurti has repeatedly drawn considerable attention to this process of turning inward. So, can you elaborate on this?
Yeah, this is one of the terms which are so characteristic of Sri J. Krishnamurti, because I've said elsewhere that the whole tenor of the teaching and the direction of the teaching represents a paradigm shift. And this turning inward is one of the new words in the vocabulary of Krishnamurti. And what does it mean? Now, usually, the whole very, very subtle, shift in consciousness of turning inward is more or less unknown to us, because there is a default setting in consciousness whereby consciousness has got all its doors and windows wide open to sensory influx, the eyes, the ears, and the fragrances and the sense of touch and everything. So consciousness is very vulnerable, and the sensory inputs are very pervasive, and they come into consciousness, flooding the field of consciousness. So we are perpetually, from birth till death, you could say, that the whole orientation of consciousness is outward turned. It's more or less the default setting. It's the default setting given by the divine.
Yeah.
Now, therefore, when you speak of turning inward, it is a correction in that setting, which some God in some heaven is not going to come and make the shift in the setting. And it is left to you to play with the knobs in consciousness and to correct the setting from an outward perception to an inward perception. It is left to man and his wisdom and his understanding for him to do the correcting of default setting, which is given to us by nature. Yes.
So under what conditions would you eventually turn inward?
Okay, that's a very good question. You see, it happened prior to Krishnamurti. The whole question of turning inward vis-a-vis continuing to be extroverted and abiding in the outward engrossment in the sensory world is the normal thing. Nobody questioned it. But Krishnamurti has brought in the new paradigm of turning inward. And the turning inward happens because the master has given a cue that there is such a thing as turning inward. And prior to that, if somebody does not give you the cue and does not open a door for you to turn inward, then you don't even know that it exists as a potentiality and a possibility that you can turn inward. Now, you will turn inward when you're in a huge boiling crisis, where all the tactics and the mischief and the manipulations of the self have come to naught, and the self is writhing in agony. It's in its last agonies, more or less. And then that self probably comes to one of Krishnamurti's public talks, and then it listens to the master talking that there's a thing called turning inward, because all other doors are closed. There's no other door which is open to the self. It knows not what to do in these circumstances. And then it hears the master saying that then the challenge will tell you that you have to turn inward. So it listens to the words, but it's not yet picked up the inner meaning. Now, when you turn inward, prior to turning inward, you're completely focused and engrossed on a certain number of causes in the outside world, which you imagined were the perpetrators of your suffering and the causes of your suffering, and you're fighting a losing battle with those causes and with those individuals whom you think are your enemies. But then you heard a new thing the masters say, that you must turn inward. So suddenly some miraculous thing happened and you start watching yourself. So previously you were watching only the world, you were criticizing the world, you were condemning the world, you were judging the world, you were throwing accusations against the world, and now suddenly you find that you become very sensitive to the movement of every thought and feeling, and you begin to watch it, thank God, without judgment, without criticism, without condemnation, and the turning inward just happened. And traditional people who have studied the religions, they will say this happened by the grace of the divine. But it happened because Krishnamurti's possibility of turning inward, which you accidentally heard by going to a talk, somehow it was seeded into your consciousness and you took it because all gates were closed for you. And therefore it got in. And therefore you entered into the never before visited world of the inner world.
People often ask, is whether turning inward is necessary to solve our human problems. Because could we not solve our problems without turning inward? Because they think it's it's an unheard of thing. And no matter, even if they might have sat at a lecture by Krishnamurti, but they really would not really comprehend what that meant, and they would just think that perhaps it is something that those are just words which have just gone in. So maybe if they were lucky enough to read, as you pointed out, that they do turn inwards and they say that something happened to me and it was all by the grace of the divine. If they come to that state, then they perhaps will have a recap of what Krishnamurti spoke and said, oh, that was what he was talking about, So people ask, do we really have to turn inward?
You are asking really the devil's question. Huh?
Yeah, because it is not something which is like, a lot of people, when they have a lot of problems, what they would like to do is, what they would like to hear is that they would say, go to a particular temple or go to a church and do this puja or do that something, or you chant this, or you do this thing, and then you think that by that time, or by having done all that, you have all your problems are going to be gone, but that is not quite the case. You might just have a temporary feeling that you are very happy that you have done your bit, and okay, it's all bound to happen. But this turning inward seems to be a very big task, and it's...
See, you might as well, yes, you're right, but look at the history of so-called progress or evolution, socio-cultural evolution, technological evolution. We could all be riding bullock carts. But then we are driving in cars today, and we are flying in aeroplanes, and we are going in ocean liners. And this is because man is continuously probing into the unknown, and he's never satisfied with a solution which he has arrived at. And man, by very nature, has got the divine architecture of an endless quest, going deeper and deeper. Now, if you don't turn inward, then what usually happens is, if two people are in confrontation and they have a quarrel, let us say husband and wife, or two nations even, one which are at loggerheads with each other. Now, you can take your adversary to the court. You can enter into litigation. And this is how usually people settle scores. You go to the court, or in extreme cases, you commit a murder. You kidnap the child of your adversary, and you do all sorts of macabre things like that, because man is fundamentally evil, and the evil doesn't reside outside of him. It's there right in his heart. And the question is to understand it and to put it in its proper place so that good prevails over evil. There's a balance. That's the whole unfolding of the spiritual life. And if you don't turn inward, there are always inferior solutions available, like litigation, like manipulation, like cutting the person to size, as they say, and like kidnapping, and like bombing him out of all his opportunities so that he becomes a nobody in life. And those are all methods, even murder in extreme cases. You see it happening in politics all the time. And those are inferior solutions. But the superior solution, the solution of the gods, I would say that, is to turn inward.
Yeah.
Now, if 10 people turn inward, then don't you think that is a very encouraging thing for the whole of humanity to turn inward? And if there are no examples at all of people having turned inward, then doesn't it make it very difficult for the whole of humanity to draw inspiration and then turn inward?
Yeah.
Yes. So therefore, this is a more intelligent solution. This is a durable, everlasting solution to the problem of duality and the problem of enmity and the problem of suffering. And so the Master is opening a door there, this turning inward. It's a new door.
Yeah.
Very consciously has opened it.
Now, just like turning inward is something which is very important to Krishnamurti, there must be a lot of special vocabulary which we have to learn as we go along these files, So maybe you can tell us something of the special vocabulary that the world teacher Krishnamurti chooses to say.
Yes, there's a whole set of words which Sri J. Krishnamurti is using in a new way. And we have got to be very sensitive to those words if we have to understand the tenor of the world teacher's teachings. Now, let's look at what happened during the tenure of the Soviet leader Gorbachev. 1990 probably, 1989, 1991, when the Soviet Union was collapsing. Yeah. And Gorbachev initiated a paradigm shift, political paradigm shift in the Soviet world through two very significant terms, glasnost and perestroika. Now, glasnost means being open and being responsible for what you create. And perestroika means entertaining the possibility of restructuring a whole nation, a whole people's destiny, and things like that. And then if we look at the struggle for freedom of the Indian people, spearheaded by Mahatma Gandhi, then two new terms, ahimsa and satyagraha. Ahimsa is the method and approach of non-violence, not going into battle, not taking to weapons, not killing each other. And then satyagraha is tenacious holding on to the truth. Satya is truth, and aparigraha is gripping, parigraha is gripping. So you grip the truth like gripping the aerial root of a banyan tree and never letting go of it. That is the equivalent of satyagraha. You never let go of it. You stick to it very tenaciously. So those were the two paradigms through which Mahatma Gandhi moved the freedom movement of the Indian people. And you can see this, for example, when the Buddha emerged around 500 BC. He created a completely new worldview with a new vocabulary, which was not Vedic in its origin. He created the paradigm called Pratitya Samutpada, dependently arising, which the Vedic seers and the Vedic rishis never heard of it. It's a completely new development in the spiritual realm, which the Buddha discovered, Pratitya Samutpada. And likewise, Krishnamurti, because he ushers in a paradigm shift, he is using words in a whole lot of different ways. And some of those words are what is, for example, and what should be. Now, by that he means what is means what reality is. Where? In which domain? In the inner domain of consciousness, where that reality could be the reality of anger, the reality of jealousy, the reality of a very strong sense of divisiveness, and the reality of guilt, the reality of fear, the reality of loneliness, and the reality of suffering, the reality of despair, and the reality of dishonor and disgrace. and the reality of failure. Because every human being has to go through all these things. And therefore, that is the what is. That is what really is. It's come to stay. It may stay for a month, it may stay for 10 days, it may stay for a year, it may stay for 14 years. As in the Indian epics of Ramayana and Mahabharata, you see a long drawn out what is. So Rama going to the forest for long many years, and the Pancha Pandavas being in anonymous existence for long many years. So that what is can drag on, and what should be is a wishful thinking on the part of the self. It's a projection, an escape from what is, not knowing how to contend with that what is, which is very challenging for the self. The self throws up a cheap solution of what should be and tries to pursue that solution in the futile hope that by pursuing that solution, it is going to be successful in running away from what is, in being delivered from what is, but that never happens. It never happens. So what is and what should be is one thing. Then Krishnamurti is also using another word. Everything that he uses is very subtle. He uses the word vulnerable. Now, vulnerable means you must be vulnerable to be injured, to be hurt. You must be vulnerable to life. Because life will kiss you and life will kick you. Life will do both things. So Krishnamurti's whole thing is he asks you to pay very close attention to the moment of life and to be in those waters, to travel with those waters, to open yourself to those waters and to receive whatever life is giving you. And it'll always be a mixed story. It'll be an embrace and then it'll be a kick. So that is vulnerable. And then Krishnamurti also says that you have to somehow begin from the other end, from the other shore, and not always be concerned with this shore or how to cross the river. Now people say the other shore is the final thing, it has to come at the end. But Krishnamurti says, no, we have to begin from there. And there's no question of journey, he's aborting your journey. Because the journey belongs to the self, and the journey is a whole process of becoming, and he's taking a pistol and shooting it off. So the self is not going to get a new lease of life. It has to contend with the possibility that it has no future. And it's a dramatic new shift in thinking. And that is one thing. And then Krishnamurti says freedom is in the very beginning, freedom is not in the end. That's again a new usage. People have not heard of this. And the master has explained himself what he means by that. The freedom first and last. And then the moment you have authority, then you're not going to flower. You're not going to flower intellectually, emotionally, morally, and spiritually. You're not going to flower. And you will flower only in freedom. So you've got to begin that flowering by setting aside all authority, which is a new line of thinking, which is a new approach in religion.
Yeah.
So the master has got a whole repertoire of new words and new expressions and new phrases, and we need to consider every one of them very carefully and discuss them very well. Otherwise, we are not going to understand what he's talking about.
He has also introduced a rather enigmatic principle of the observer and the observed. So, how did he arrive at this? Could you explain a little more on this?
Now, this is a very deep and very involved perception of Krishnamurti, and I feel that we should consider it separately because though we may not want to take it that far, as we start dialoguing about this, it will inevitably spill over into Krishnamurti's dialogue with Professor David Bohm, and then we have got to consider the kindred thing, a connection between the observer and the observed, which is given to us by quantum theory. And so we have got to discuss both together, even though both are not the same. Both are they're kindred, but they're not the same. They're different from each other. And we need a lot more of time to go very deeply into Krishnamurti's sutra of the observer is the observed, and then also into the corresponding quantum insight, the connection between the observer and the observed. Then Krishnamurti, we also need to talk at length about Krishnamurti's very unintelligible expression, thought creates the thinker. Now, this is, we've got to devote time for this. Thought creates the thinker. People don't understand what he's meaning by this. And his meaning actually something which is part of the human experience for everybody. But the vocabulary of the master is new. Therefore, we don't get it on the face of it unless we delve into it. We will do it on another occasion.
Okay.